The sun had scorched the Arizona territory for 7 consecutive days without mercy, and somewhere between the railroad camp and the distant promise of Tucson, Catherine Monroe realized she was going to die alone in this God-forsaken wasteland. Her lips had cracked 3 days ago, splitting open like dried leather until even the copper taste of her own blood became a perverse comfort. The wagon train she had been traveling with lay 5 days behind her now, destroyed by a flash flood that had torn through the canyon with biblical fury. She had been gathering firewood on higher ground when the water came, and by the time she scrambled back down the rocky slope, there was nothing left but splintered wood, scattered supplies, and bodies trapped beneath muddy debris. She had salvaged what she could carry in a canvas sack, but that meager supply of hardtack and jerked beef had run out 2 days ago. The canteen had been empty since yesterday morning. Catherine stumbled forward on legs that no longer felt like her own, each step a negotiation between will and flesh. The year was 1881, and she was 22 years old, a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had been foolish enough to believe that the West held opportunity for a woman with education and ambition. Her father had died in a factory fire when she was 19, her mother of influenza the following winter, and the boarding house where she had been living had burned down 6 months ago. The advertisement for teachers in the Arizona territory had seemed like divine intervention, a chance to start fresh where the past could not follow. Now she understood that the past was not the most dangerous thing that could follow a person. The desert itself was a living threat, patient and thorough in its killing. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a monotonous expanse of sand, scrub brush, and distant mesas that never seemed to grow closer no matter how long she walked. The sun hammered down from a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the heat rose up from the ground in shimmering waves that turned the horizon into a liquid mirage. She had long since abandoned her traveling coat and the ridiculous hat with its decorative ribbon. Her dark hair hung in tangled ropes around her face, and her dress, once of respectable gray wool, was now torn at the hem and stained with sweat, dirt, and blood from where she had fallen against the rocks. She fell again now, pitching forward onto her hands and knees. The sand burned against her palms, and for a long moment she simply knelt there, her head hanging between her shoulders. It would be so easy to just lie down, to let the heat and the thirst take her into unconsciousness and then beyond. She had read once that freezing to death was supposed to be peaceful at the end, that the cold eventually felt warm. Perhaps dying of thirst was the same. Perhaps at some point the burning would stop and there would only be silence. But something stubborn in her core refused to surrender. Perhaps it was the same stubborn streak that had made her leave Philadelphia in the first place. The same refusal to simply accept what life offered without fighting for something better. Catherine pushed herself back to her feet, swaying dangerously, and forced her legs to move again. One step, another. Keep walking. What else was there to do but keep walking? The sun climbed higher, reached its apex, and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Catherine's thoughts began to fragment, breaking apart like sun-bleached bones. She thought of her mother's apple pie, the way the crust would flake on her tongue. She thought of the schoolroom where she had taught for 2 years, the smell of chalk dust and the sound of children reciting their letters. She thought of a boy named Thomas who had kissed her once behind the church after a summer. Social, sweet and brief, and full of a promise that had never materialized into anything more. She did not think about dying. If she thought about dying, her legs would stop moving, and if her legs stopped moving, it would be over. The sun was touching the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple and red, when she saw the shape in the distance. At first she thought it was another mirage, a trick of heat and dehydration, but as she walked, the shape remained constant, solidifying into the form of a man on horseback, leading a pack mule behind him. Catherine tried to call out, but her throat was so dry that only a faint croaking sound emerged. She waved her arm instead, a desperate gesture that nearly sent her toppling sideways. The figure seemed to hesitate, and then the horse began moving toward her at a faster pace. As the rider drew closer, Catherine could make out more details through the haze of her failing vision. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face. His shirt had once been blue, but was now faded nearly white by sun and washing, and he wore a bandana tied loosely around his neck. A gun belt sat at his hips, and rifle was secured to his saddle. He looked like every other cowboy she had seen in her brief time in the territory, weathered and practical and hard. The horse stopped a few feet from where Catherine stood, swaying on her feet. The man dismounted with fluid grace, and she found herself looking up into a face that was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of stubble and eyes the color of storm clouds. Those eyes widened as he took in her condition. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "How long have you been out here?" Catherine tried to answer, but her knees buckled instead. The cowboy caught her before she hit the ground, his hands strong and steady on her arms. He eased her down into the sand with surprising gentleness, and she heard him moving, heard the sound of a cork being pulled from a canteen. "Slow," he said, and then there was blessed coolness against her lips. Water, actual water, not a fantasy or a fever dream. It touched her cracked lips, slid over her tongue, down her throat. She tried to gulp it desperately, but he pulled the canteen back. "I said slow. You drink too fast, you will just bring it back up." He let her have another small sip, then another. Catherine felt tears sliding down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt and sweat. The water was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. Better than wine, better than anything. She wanted to drown in it, to pour it over her entire body. But the cowboy was careful, rationing each sip, waiting between each one to make sure she could keep it down. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper, her voice like gravel. "Thank you." The cowboy nodded, studying her face with those serious gray eyes. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Where is your party?" "Gone," Catherine said. "Flash flood. 5 days ago, maybe 6. I do not know any more. I have been walking since then." His expression shifted, something that might have been sympathy, or might have been respect, flickering across his features. "You have been walking alone through the desert for 6 days?" "I did not have much choice." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "No, I reckon you did not." He offered her another drink, and this time she was able to take a larger swallow without choking. "My name is Jack Garrett. I run cattle north of here, near Prescott. Been down to Tombstone on business, heading back home now." "Catherine Monroe," she said. "I was supposed to be teaching school in Tucson." "Tucson is about 40 miles southeast of here," Jack said, glancing at the sun. "You have been walking the wrong direction." Catherine felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest. Of course she had been walking the wrong direction. Of course. "I suppose that explains why I never found it," she said, and then the laughter did come, wild and slightly unhinged. Jack waited patiently until she got control of herself again. "Can you travel?" he asked. "I have got a camp about 2 hours north of here, near a spring. You need food and rest before we do anything else." "I can travel," Catherine said, though she was not at all sure that was true. But Jack was already moving, untying a bedroll from behind his saddle and spreading it over the pack mule's back to make a crude seat. He helped her stand, and when her legs threatened to give out again, he simply lifted her bodily and set her on the mule as though she weighed nothing. "Hold on to the harness," he instructed. "We will go slow." True to his word, Jack kept the pace easy, leading the mule by its rope while he walked beside his horse. The sun sank below the horizon, and the desert transformed into a landscape of shadows and cooling air. Catherine clung to the mule's harness, her head swimming, barely aware of the passage of time. She drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake each time she started to slip sideways. True dark had fallen by the time they reached Jack's camp, a simple arrangement of a bedroll and saddle near a cluster of rocks where water seeped from the ground into a shallow pool. Jack lifted Catherine down from the mule and settled her on his bedroll, then set about building a small fire with practiced efficiency. She watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, noting the competent way he moved, the economy of his gestures. This was a man who had spent a great deal of time alone in wild places. He heated water in a battered tin pot and mixed something into it from a cloth bag, then brought the cup to her. "Drink this," he said. "It is just broth from dried meat, but it will help settle your stomach before you try eating solid food." The broth was salty and rich and absolutely perfect. Catherine sipped it slowly, feeling warmth spread through her body for the first time in days. Jack watched her drink, then nodded in satisfaction and turned his attention to caring for his animals, unsaddling his horse and checking the mule's hooves with methodical care. "Why did you help me?" Catherine asked when she found her voice again. "You could have just ridden past." Jack glanced at her over his shoulder, his face half shadowed by the firelight. "What kind of question is that?" "A practical one. This is dangerous country. I am a stranger. You do not know anything about me." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I know you walked 6 days through the desert without water and did not quit," he said quietly. "I know you were still breathing when most people would have laid down and died. That is enough." "You asked for nothing in return," Catherine pressed. "No payment, no promise of reward." Jack's expression was unreadable in the flickering light. "Lady, if you have to be paid to offer water to someone dying of thirst, then you are not much of a human being." He moved back to the fire and began slicing jerky into thin strips. "Besides, my mama would rise up out of her grave and haunt me for eternity if I left a woman to die in the desert. She did not raise me that way." Catherine felt something warm bloom in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the broth or the fire. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Jack said, and there was a weight to those words that spoke of loss. "She died when I was 15. Cholera epidemic that came through our settlement. Took her and my little sister both within 3 days of each other." "I am sorry." He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in the set of his shoulders. "Long time ago now. My father went a few years later, got thrown from a horse and broke his neck. That is when I came to Arizona, figured I would start fresh somewhere new." He handed her a piece of jerky. "Chew it slow, let it soften in your mouth before you swallow." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the vast darkness of the desert pressing in from all sides. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, so many and so bright that Catherine felt dizzy looking at them. She had never seen stars like this in Philadelphia, where the smoke from factories and the glow of streetlights dimmed the heavens. Out here, the universe felt close enough to touch. "What made you want to come west?" Jack asked eventually. "Philadelphia is a long way from Arizona territory." Catherine chewed another piece of jerky, organizing her thoughts. "I had nothing left there," she said finally. "My parents were dead, the boarding house I lived in burned down, and I was tired of feeling like I was just waiting for my life to start. I saw an advertisement seeking teachers for the territorial schools, and it seemed like a sign, a chance to do something that mattered, to build something new." "Teaching matters," Jack said. "We need more schools out here, more people willing to educate the next generation." "If I ever make it to Tucson," Catherine said wryly. "You will make it," Jack said with quiet certainty. "We will head that direction tomorrow, after you have had a chance to rest and recover. It is only a few days' ride if we take it steady." Catherine blinked at him. "You do not have to do that. You said you were headed to Prescott." "Prescott is not going anywhere," Jack replied, "and I am not leaving you to wander around the desert alone. Like I said, my mama would haunt me." "You are a good man, Jack Garrett." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting his weight and adjusting his hat. "I am just a man who knows what is right. Now you should get some sleep. We have a long few days ahead of us." He gave her his bedroll and took the saddle for himself, settling on the far side of the fire with his rifle within easy reach. Catherine wanted to protest, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. She lay down on the bedroll, which smelled faintly of horse and leather and something clean that must have been Jack himself, and closed her eyes. She expected nightmares, visions of the flood and the bodies and the endless burning sun. But instead she slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally able to rest now that she was safe. When she woke, the sun was already climbing toward noon. Catherine jerked upright in panic, disoriented and confused, but Jack's calm voice immediately soothed her. "Easy," he said. "You needed the rest. I have been up for hours, let the animals graze and refilled the canteens at the spring." Catherine pushed her hair back from her face, suddenly acutely aware of how she must look, filthy and bedraggled and wild. But Jack was not looking at her with judgment or disgust, just patient concern. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She took inventory of her body. Her lips were still cracked and sore, her skin sunburned and tender, her muscles aching from days of walking. But the desperate gnawing thirst had receded, and her head felt clearer than it had in days. "Better," she said. "Much better." "Good. Drink more water, then we will get you something to eat before we head out." The next few days fell into a steady rhythm. They traveled during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the worst heat of the afternoon. Jack was an easy companion, comfortable with silence but willing to talk when Catherine wanted conversation. He told her about his ranch, a modest operation with about 200 head of cattle and a small cabin he had built himself. He spoke of the land with genuine affection, describing the way the high country around Prescott turned green after the summer rains, the way the elk would move down from the mountains in winter. Catherine, in turn, told him about Philadelphia, about teaching rowdy children their letters and numbers, about the way the city smelled like coal smoke and river water. She told him about her parents, her father's strong hands, and her mother's lovely singing voice. She told him about the books she loved, the way stories could transport you somewhere completely different, make you feel things that everyday life never quite touched. Jack listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed that he was really paying attention. It struck Catherine that she had rarely met men who actually listened, who seemed to care about what she thought and felt, rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. On the third day, they encountered a group of miners heading north, rough men with suspicious eyes who looked at Catherine in a way that made her skin crawl. But Jack positioned his horse between her and them, his hand resting casually on his gun, and something in his posture made the miners decide to move along without incident. "Does that happen often?" Catherine asked when they were alone again. "Men causing trouble?" "Often enough," Jack said grimly. "The territory attracts all kinds, and not all of them learned proper manners, but most men will back down if they know you are willing to stand your ground." He glanced at her. "When we get to Tucson, you make sure you find respectable lodging. The town has been growing fast, and not all of it has been good growth." "I will be careful," Catherine promised. That night they camped near a dry wash lined with cottonwood trees. Jack shot a rabbit, and they roasted it over the fire, the smell of cooking meat making Catherine's mouth water. As they ate, Jack asked her about what she planned to teach. "Reading, writing, arithmetic," Catherine said. "The basics that every child needs. But I also want to teach them about the wider world, about history and geography and science. So many children out here grow up knowing only their immediate surroundings. I want to give them windows into everything else that exists." "Sounds like you really love it," Jack observed. "Teaching, I mean." "I do," Catherine said, surprised by the passion in her own voice. "I love seeing the moment when something clicks for a student, when they suddenly understand something they had been struggling with. It is like watching a door open in their minds." Jack smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face into something warmer and more open. "The children in Tucson are lucky to be getting you." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "We will see if they agree after I start assigning them homework." They reached Tucson on the afternoon of the fourth day. The town sprawled across the desert basin, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that seemed to shimmer in the heat. It was larger than Catherine had expected, with real streets and shops and even a church spire visible above the other buildings. Jack led them to a respectable-looking boarding house run by a formidable Mexican woman named Señora Alvarez, who took one look at Catherine and immediately began clucking over her in a mixture of Spanish and English. Within minutes, Catherine found herself being ushered into a clean room with an actual bed and told that hot water for a bath would be brought up immediately. Jack waited in the hallway, hat in his hands, suddenly looking awkward. "I will go get your teaching position sorted out," he said. "Make sure the school board knows you have arrived. Where were you supposed to report?" Catherine gave him the name from the advertisement, and he nodded. "I know the man. I will let him know you are here and that you will call on him tomorrow once you have had a chance to recover properly." "Jack," Catherine said, and he looked up at her. She realized she did not want him to leave, did not want this strange, intense period of her life to end. In 4 days, this quiet cowboy had become the most important person in her world. "Thank you for everything. You saved my life." "You saved your own life," Jack said quietly. "I just helped a little at the end." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I should head out. Got a long ride back to Prescott." "Of course," Catherine said, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. "Safe travels." Jack settled his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a small salute, and turned to go. He made it 3 steps before he stopped and turned back. "Miss Monroe," he said, and there was something different in his voice, something almost vulnerable. Would it be all right if I came back to visit sometime, just to see how you were settling in? Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. I would like that very much, Mr. Garrett. Jack, he said. Just Jack. Then you should call me Catherine. He smiled again, that transformative smile that made her breath catch. Catherine, he said, like he was testing the shape of her name. I will be back in a few weeks, once I get things sorted at the ranch, if that is all right. That would be more than all right. He nodded, seeming satisfied, and this time when he left, his step seemed lighter. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Catherine met with the school board, a group of earnest men who seemed relieved that she had actually arrived, despite the harrowing journey. The previous teacher had quit after only 2 months, unable to handle the rough conditions and rougher students. They set her up in a small schoolhouse on the edge of town, a single room with a wood stove and 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. The children were indeed rough, many of them more accustomed to working in their family businesses than sitting still for lessons. But Catherine had taught in Philadelphia, tenements where children came to school hungry and exhausted from factory work. She knew how to be firm without being cruel, how to make lessons interesting enough to capture wandering attention. Slowly, grudgingly, the students began to respond. Senora Alvarez's boarding house became her home. The older woman took Catherine under her wing, teaching her about the territory, about which parts of town were safe and which to avoid, about the complex social dynamics between the Mexican families who had been there for generations and the American settlers still arriving in waves. Catherine learned to speak a little Spanish, enough to communicate with some of her students whose English was limited, and through it all, she found herself thinking about Jack Garrett, remembering the way he had been so careful giving her water, the way he had given up his bedroll without hesitation, the way he listened when she talked. She told herself she was being foolish, that she barely knew the man, that he probably had not meant anything by saying he would visit. But she could not quite convince herself to stop hoping. 3 weeks after she had arrived in Tucson, Catherine was walking back from the general store with supplies for the school when she heard a familiar voice. You are looking considerably healthier than the last time I saw you. She spun around, and there was Jack, dismounting from his horse in front of Senora Alvarez's boarding house. He looked tired, like he had been riding hard, but his face lit up when he saw her. Jack! Catherine realized she was grinning like an idiot and did not care. You came back. I said I would, he replied, tying his horse to the hitching post. He took in her appearance, the clean dress and pinned-up hair, the color that had returned to her cheeks. Teaching seems to agree with you. It does, Catherine said. Come inside. I want to hear everything about your journey. They sat in the boarding house parlor, drinking coffee that Senora Alvarez provided with a knowing smile, and talked for hours. Jack told her about his ranch, about the 2 cowboys who worked for him, about the mountain lion that had been harassing his cattle until he managed to track it and drive it off. Catherine told him about her students, about the little girl who had learned to read her first complete sentence, about the boy who was hopeless at arithmetic but could draw the most beautiful pictures of horses. As evening fell, Senora Alvarez served them dinner, and Jack stayed after, seemingly reluctant to leave. Finally, as the candles burned low, he cleared his throat. Catherine, I need to ask you something, he said, his voice serious. And you should feel free to tell me no, or that I am being presumptuous, or that I am moving too fast. Catherine's heart was pounding. Ask. I have not been able to stop thinking about you, Jack said, the words coming out in a rush. Not since the day I found you in the desert. I know we have only known each other a short time, but those days we spent traveling together, they meant something to me. You mean something to me. He met her eyes, his own storm-gray gaze intense. I would like to court you properly, if you are willing. Catherine felt like the sun had risen inside her chest. I have been thinking about you too, she admitted, hoping you would come back, wondering if I was foolish for caring so much about someone I barely know. You are not foolish, Jack said softly, and if you are, then so am I. Then yes, Catherine said. I would very much like for you to court me. Jack's smile was brilliant and relieved. He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. I will do right by you, Catherine Monroe. I promise you that. Over the following months, Jack made the long journey from Prescott to Tucson as often as he could manage, usually every 2 or 3 weeks. Each visit was precious, time stolen from the demands of ranch work and teaching, carved out just for each other. They took walks through the town, attended church services together, shared meals at the boarding house while Senora Alvarez played the world's most understanding chaperone. Catherine learned more about the man beneath the quiet cowboy exterior. She learned that Jack loved to read, that his cabin had a small shelf of books he had collected over the years, westerns and dime novels, but also Shakespeare and Dickens. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. She learned that he was respected by his neighbors, known as a man who kept his word and helped out when someone needed it. Jack learned about Catherine's dreams, her hope to eventually expand the school, maybe even establish a small library for the town. He learned about her fierce independence, the way she insisted on managing her own affairs even when he offered to help. He learned that she had a temper when provoked, but that it burned hot and fast and then was gone, leaving no lingering resentment. He learned that she sang when she thought no one was listening, old folk songs her mother had taught her. They fell in love slowly and then all at once, like a river that builds gradually before suddenly rushing over a cliff. By the time winter arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the desert briefly green, Catherine could not imagine her life without Jack in it. He proposed on a clear December evening under a sky full of stars that reminded Catherine of that first night at his camp. They had ridden out to the desert together, properly chaperoned by one of Senora Alvarez's nephews, who stayed at a discreet distance, and Jack spread a blanket on the sand so they could watch the sunset. "Catherine," he said as the last light faded from the sky, "I am not a wealthy man. I have a small ranch, a cabin that needs work, and a life that is not easy. But I love you more than I thought I could love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my days making you happy." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone. "Will you marry me?" Catherine's vision blurred with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes. Absolutely yes." The ring fit perfectly, and when Jack kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, Catherine felt like she had finally found what she had been searching for when she left Philadelphia. Not just a new place, but a new home. Not just a fresh start, but a future. They were married in March of 1882, in the small church in Tucson, with Senora Alvarez, and half the town in attendance. Catherine wore a simple white dress that Senora Alvarez had helped her sew, and Jack wore a new suit that made him look slightly uncomfortable, but undeniably handsome. The school board gave her leave for a brief honeymoon, and Jack arranged for his hired hands to manage the ranch while he was away. They spent a week in Tucson before making the journey north to Jack's ranch. Catherine was nervous about leaving the town, about giving up her teaching position, but Jack had been adamant that the decision was hers. "I will not ask you to give up something you love," he had said. "We can figure out a way for you to keep teaching, even if it means I move my operation closer to Tucson." But Catherine had been thinking about it for months, and she had made her choice. "There are children in the high country who need education too," she said. "Maybe I can start a small school near Prescott, teach the ranch children in the area." Jack's expression had been a mixture of love and respect. "If anyone can make that happen, it is you." The ranch was more isolated than Catherine had expected, tucked into a valley with pine-covered mountains rising on 3 sides and open grazing land stretching to the south. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from logs with a stone fireplace that Jack had laid himself. It was a single large room with a sleeping loft, rough but clean, with windows that looked out on the most beautiful vista Catherine had ever seen. "We can add on," Jack said anxiously, watching her take it all in. "Build a separate bedroom, maybe a proper kitchen. I know it is not much right now." "It is perfect," Catherine said, and meant it. She had grown up in cramped Philadelphia apartments and boarding house rooms. This cabin, with its mountain views and clear air and the sound of wind in the pines, felt like a palace. The hired hands, 2 cowboys named Tom and Miguel, were respectful and friendly. They helped Catherine settle in, showing her where things were stored, explaining the rhythms of ranch life. Tom was a lean man in his 40s who had worked cattle his whole life, quiet and competent. Miguel was younger, maybe 20, with an easy smile and a gift for working with horses. Catherine threw herself into learning her new life with the same determination she had brought to teaching. She learned to cook over the fireplace, to make bread and stew and biscuits that did not turn out like rocks. She learned to identify the different cattle brands, to understand the cycle of calving and branding and drives. She learned to ride properly, moving beyond the side saddle she had used in Tucson, to riding astride like the ranch women did when no one from town was watching. And slowly she began reaching out to the other families scattered across the high country. There were perhaps a dozen ranches within a day's ride, most of them with children who received little or no formal education. Catherine proposed starting a small school, meeting 3 days a week in the spring and fall, using Jack's cabin as the classroom. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents were hungry for their children to have opportunities they had never had, to learn to read and write and cipher. By April, Catherine had 8 students ranging from 7 to 13, sitting at a makeshift table in Jack's cabin while he worked outside, learning their letters and numbers. Life settled into a rhythm that felt right in a way nothing ever had before. Catherine taught her small school, managed the household, learned the 1,000 small skills that ranching required. Jack worked his cattle, expanded his herd gradually, built the additions to the cabin he had promised. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch he constructed, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Catherine would read aloud from books while Jack mended tack or carved pieces of wood into useful objects. They made love with increasing confidence and joy, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and closeness. Catherine had been nervous on their wedding night, her knowledge of such things limited to vague warnings from other women and her own reading between the lines of romantic novels. But Jack had been patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and wanted. And as the weeks passed, nervousness gave way to passion, to a physical intimacy that matched the emotional connection they shared. By summer, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Jack one evening in June, after they had finished dinner and were sitting together watching the stars emerge. "I think I am with child," she said quietly. Jack went very still beside her. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide and wondering. "Truly? I am almost certain. I have missed my courses for 2 months, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings." Jack let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. He swept Catherine up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down carefully as though she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of awe. "Catherine, we are going to have a baby." "We are," she confirmed, feeling joy bubble up inside her. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Jack cupped her face in his hands, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I am the happiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Catherine had to stop riding and limit her school to just 2 days a week as she grew larger, but she refused to stop entirely. The children needed her, she insisted, and sitting still all day would drive her mad. Jack hovered, worried and protective, but he was careful not to smother her. He understood that Catherine needed to maintain her independence, to feel useful and capable. But he also made sure she had everything she needed, riding into Prescott once a month to buy supplies, arranging for one of the neighbor women to come check on Catherine when he had to be away from the ranch. The baby arrived in late February of 1883, during a late winter storm that covered the mountains in fresh snow. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Senora Martinez, the neighbor woman who had birthed 6 children of her own and served as midwife for the scattered ranching community. Jack paced outside in the cold, praying to a God he was not entirely sure he believed in, listening to Catherine's cries and feeling helpless. But when Senora Martinez finally emerged and told him he had a healthy son, when he went inside and saw Catherine exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny red-faced infant to her chest, every moment of fear evaporated. "Meet your son," Catherine said softly. Jack approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the tiny scrunched face. The baby had dark hair and eyes that would probably turn gray like his father's. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. "What should we name him?" Jack asked, his voice rough with emotion. Catherine had been thinking about this. "I would like to name him James, after my father, James Garrett." "James Garrett," Jack repeated, testing the name. "I like it." He touched one finger to the baby's impossibly small hand, and James immediately gripped it with surprising strength. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Parenthood transformed them both. Jack discovered reserves of tenderness he had not known he possessed, staying up through the night when James was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with a crying infant when Catherine was too exhausted to move. Catherine found that the fierce protective love she felt for her students was nothing compared to the overwhelming devotion she felt for this tiny person they had created. The cabin rang with baby cries and laughter. Tom and Miguel were endlessly amused by their boss's transformation into a doting father, though they were careful not to tease too much. The neighbors brought food and baby clothes and advice, welcoming James into the community. Catherine suspended her small school for a few months while she recovered and adjusted to motherhood. But by the time James was 6 months old, she was teaching again, with the baby sleeping in a cradle in the corner of the room. The students were fascinated by the new addition, competing for the privilege of holding him during breaks. Life was not easy. There were hard winters when food ran short and they had to stretch supplies. There were seasons when cattle died from disease or drought. There was the constant work of maintaining a ranch, the endless cycle of tasks that had to be done, whether you felt like it or not. But through it all, Catherine and Jack had each other, and that made everything bearable. When James was 2, Catherine became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy felt easier, even though she was busier, chasing after a toddler while trying to teach and manage the household. Jack had expanded the cabin significantly, adding a proper bedroom and a room that served as both classroom and parlor. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1885, an easier birth than James had been. They named her Sarah, after Jack's mother, and she was a calm, easy baby who seemed content to observe the world with solemn gray eyes. The years flowed past like water. James grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and work cattle almost before he could read, though Catherine made sure he had his letters too. Sarah was quieter, more bookish, content to sit with her mother and practice writing or help with the younger school children. Catherine's small school grew as more families settled in the high country. By 1888, she had nearly 20 students, and the classroom in the cabin was no longer adequate. Jack and the neighbors built a small separate schoolhouse, one room with proper desks and a blackboard, and Catherine felt like a real teacher again. Jack's ranch prospered modestly. He would never be wealthy, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had respect in the community. Jack was known as a fair man, someone you could trust to keep his word. Catherine was known as the teacher who never gave up on a student, who believed every child could learn if given the right chance. In 1890, when James was 7 and Sarah 5, Catherine realized she was pregnant again. She was 31 now, and she felt the pregnancy more than she had the previous 2. But when their second daughter was born, in early 1891, tiny and perfect with dark hair like Catherine's, all the discomfort was worth it. "What should we call her?" Jack asked, holding the infant with practiced ease. "I have been thinking about Rose," Catherine said. "Rosemary, maybe." "Rosemary Garrett," Jack said, smiling down at the baby. "That is beautiful." Life settled into a new rhythm with 3 children. The house was chaotic and loud, full of children's voices and laughter and occasional tears. Catherine juggled teaching and motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything, and Jack proved to be as devoted a father to 3 as he had been to 1. The children grew. James became a serious boy, responsible and hardworking, already talking about running the ranch someday. Sarah discovered a love of music and somehow convinced her parents to buy a second-hand piano that had to be hauled up from Prescott in a wagon, then practiced for hours until she could play hymns and folk songs. Rose was the wild one, always climbing trees and chasing after her brother, refusing to wear dresses if she could help it. In 1895, Catherine stood on the porch of the expanded cabin that was now almost a proper house, watching Jack teach James how to break a young horse. Sarah was inside practicing piano, the music drifting through the open windows. Rose was supposed to be doing her lessons, but was instead building what looked like a fort out of kindling wood. Catherine was 36 years old. Lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes, and her hands bore the calluses of ranch work. Her hair, which she still wore long, had threads of gray beginning to appear. But she felt more herself than she ever had in Philadelphia, more complete than she had been even in Tucson. She thought about the girl she had been, walking through the desert, dying of thirst, certain her story was ending. She thought about Jack appearing like something out of a fever dream, offering water and asking nothing in return. She thought about how that single act of simple human kindness had led to all of this life, this family, this home. "Mama," Rose called, "look at my fort." "It is very impressive, sweetheart," Catherine called back, "but you are supposed to be practicing your spelling words." Rose made a face but dutifully gathered her spilled kindling and headed inside. Catherine smiled, shaking her head. That child was going to be trouble. Jack finished with the horse and walked over to the porch, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was 39 now, his hair starting to gray at the temples, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. But his gray eyes were the same, serious and kind, and when he smiled at Catherine, she felt her heart skip exactly the way it had when he first asked to court her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling onto the porch step beside her. "Just remembering," Catherine said. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Remembering how we met, how you saved my life." "You saved your own life," Jack said, the same words he had spoken all those years ago. "I just helped at the end." "You did more than help," Catherine said softly. "You gave me water when I was dying. You asked for nothing in return. You were kind when you did not have to be. And you gave me all of this." She gestured to the ranch, the children, the life they had built. "Everything I have, everything I am now, started that day in the desert." Jack was quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think I was the one who got lucky that day. I was just a lonely cowboy with a ranch and not much else. And then I found this extraordinary woman walking through the desert, too stubborn to quit. She turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "We found each other," she said. "That is what matters." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to Sarah's piano practice and the distant sound of cattle and the wind in the pines. The sun moved slowly across the sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Inside the house, James came looking for his father, some question about the horses that apparently could not wait. Rose managed to spill ink all over her spelling practice and needed help cleaning it up. Sarah finished her practicing and wanted someone to listen to her new song. Life called them back to its endless demands, its mundane tasks and small crises. But before they went inside, Jack pulled Catherine close and kissed her, long and sweet and full of all the love they had built over 14 years together. "I love you, Catherine Garrett," he said against her lips. "I love you too," she replied. "Every single day, I love you more." The years continued to unfold. James grew into a young man who was the image of his father, steady and reliable, taking on more and more responsibility for the ranch. He started courting a neighbor girl named Emily when he was 19, a sweet-natured young woman who had been one of Catherine's students. They married in 1898, and Jack gave them land adjacent to the main ranch to start their own operation. Sarah surprised everyone by deciding she wanted to be a teacher like her mother. She attended the new normal school that had opened in Prescott, coming home on weekends and holidays, full of enthusiasm and new ideas. When she graduated, she took a position at the growing school in town, teaching music and literature to older students. Rose remained the wild child, more comfortable on horseback than in a parlor. She had no interest in traditional feminine pursuits, and Catherine and Jack did not force them on her. She became an accomplished rider and roper, and by the time she was 16, she was working cattle alongside the men without anyone thinking twice about it. In 1901, James and Emily had their first child, a daughter they named Catherine after her grandmother. Holding that tiny baby, seeing her son as a father, Jack felt time fold in on itself. How had they gotten here so fast? How had the years flowed past like water, carrying them from that desperate day in the desert to this moment of joy and continuation? Catherine, holding her granddaughter, felt the same sense of wonder. She was 42 now, a grandmother, a respected member of the community, a woman whose small school had helped educate 2 generations of children. The frightened young teacher from Philadelphia felt like someone from another lifetime. As the new century progressed, the Arizona territory changed around them. Tucson grew into a real city. Prescott flourished. There were more roads, more railroads, more people arriving every year. The wild isolation that had characterized the territory when Catherine first arrived was gradually giving way to civilization. but the high country where the Garrett Ranch sat remained relatively untouched, still a place where you could see for miles without spotting another human being, where the elk still moved down from the mountains in winter, and the stars still blazed in the night sky. Jack and Catherine settled into what felt like the richest part of their lives. Their children were launched, happy, building their own lives. They had 5 grandchildren by 1905, with more on the way. The ranch was successful enough that they could hire more help, taking some of the burden off aging bodies. They traveled occasionally now, taking the train to California to see the ocean, visiting Sarah in Prescott, spending time with James and Emily and their growing family. But they always came back to the ranch, to the cabin that had expanded over the years into a comfortable house, to the land they had worked and loved for more than 2 decades. On a spring evening in 1906, Catherine and Jack sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Catherine was reading by lamplight, and Jack was carving a small horse for one of the grandchildren. They were both in their late 40s now, their hair more gray than not, their bodies marked by years of hard work. But they were healthy and content, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked suddenly. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming west, everything you gave up?" Catherine looked up from her book, surprised. "Not once," she said firmly. "Not even for a moment. Do you?" "No," Jack said, "but you gave up more than I did. You had education, opportunities. You could have had an easier life." "Easier, maybe," Catherine said, "but not better, not fuller, not happier." She set down her book and moved to sit beside him. "Jack Garrett, that day in the desert when you found me and gave me water and asked for nothing in return, you gave me more than my life. You gave me yourself, your love, a family, a home. You gave me a purpose and a place to belong. How could I ever regret that?" Jack set down his carving and pulled her close. "Sometimes I still cannot believe you said yes when I asked to court you. You were this brilliant, beautiful woman, and I was just a cowboy with a small ranch." "You were never just anything," Catherine said fiercely. You are, the best man I have ever known, kind and decent and strong, everything I could have ever wanted." "I love you," Jack said, the same words he had spoken 10,000 times, but still full of meaning. "I will love you until the day I die, and beyond." "And I love you," Catherine replied, kissing him softly. "Always and forever." The years flowed on. James and Emily had 6 children eventually, a house full of noise and chaos that reminded Catherine of her own growing family. Sarah married a fellow teacher, a gentle man named Robert, and they had 3 children who all inherited their mother's love of music. Rose shocked everyone by falling in love with a veterinarian who came through the territory and following him to Texas, though she returned to visit every year and eventually convinced him to move back to Arizona. Jack and Catherine grew older together, their bodies slowing but their minds remaining sharp. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1907 with a party that brought together family and friends from across the territory. People stood and shared stories about the Garretts, about Jack's fairness and Catherine's dedication to education, about the community they had helped build. One old-timer who had been part of the group that helped build Catherine's first schoolhouse stood and said, "When Jack brought Catherine here, some of us wondered if a city girl could make it in this country. We stopped wondering pretty quickly. She is as tough as they come, but she never lost her kindness. That is a rare combination." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes. She looked around the room at the life they had built, the family they had raised, the community they had helped shape, and she thought again about that day in the desert, about dying of thirst, about a cowboy who had given her water and asked for nothing. Everything had grown from that single moment of kindness. Every good thing in her life traced back to Jack's simple decency, his willingness to help someone in need without calculating what he might gain. By 1910, they were both in their 50s, officially old by frontier standards, though neither felt particularly old. Jack still worked the ranch every day, though he let James and the hired hands do more of the heavy lifting. Catherine still taught, though her school had grown so large that she had taken on an assistant, a young woman fresh from normal school, who reminded Catherine of herself at that age. They had 12 grandchildren by then, with more on the way. The house was always full of visiting family, of children running and playing, of the rich chaos of a large, loving family. On a cool autumn evening in 1912, Catherine sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Jack came out and settled beside her, moving a little stiffly, his joints protesting the cold that was settling in. "You should come inside," Catherine said. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," Jack said. "I just want to watch the sunset with you." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after decades together. Catherine thought about all the sunsets they had watched from this porch, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, each one beautiful, each one marking another day survived and lived and enjoyed. "Catherine," Jack said quietly, "if I died tomorrow, I would die a happy man." "Do not talk like that," Catherine said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "I am not planning on going anywhere," Jack assured her, "but I mean it. I have had a good life, better than I ever expected, and it is all because of you." "It is because of us," Catherine corrected. "We built this together." "Together," Jack agreed, taking her hand. "The way it should be." They went inside as the stars began to emerge, and Catherine made coffee while Jack stoked up the fire. They read together in companionable silence, Jack working through a newspaper that was already a week old, Catherine absorbed in a novel that Sarah had sent her. Later, lying in their bed in the darkness, Catherine curled against Jack's side, the way she had done for 30 years. His arm came around her automatically, pulling her close. "Jack," she said softly, "Thank you for finding me that day, for giving me water, for everything that came after." She felt him smile against her hair. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "stopping to help a stubborn woman in the desert." "I was not stubborn," Catherine protested. "I was determined." "Same thing," Jack said, laughing softly. "Go to sleep, Catherine. We have got years and years ahead of us still." And they did. Years of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of watching Arizona Territory become the state of Arizona in 1912, of seeing automobiles gradually replace horses, of witnessing the world change in ways they never could have imagined when they first met in that vast desert. Through it all, they had each other. They grew old together, their bodies failing gradually, but their love remaining constant. Jack's hair turned completely white, and he walked with a cane eventually, but his gray eyes were still sharp and kind. Catherine's hands became gnarled with arthritis, making it hard to write on the blackboard, but she taught for as long as she could, finally retiring at 65. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1932. Catherine was 73, Jack was 76, and they were surrounded by 5 children, 23 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. The party was enormous, held at James and Emily's expanded ranch, with the entire community turning out to celebrate. Jack stood with Catherine at the center of the gathering, looking out at the sea of faces, the family they had created, the legacy they were leaving. He thought about a young man riding through the desert alone, about finding a woman on the verge of death, about making the simple choice to offer water and ask for nothing in return. That choice had led to all of this. Every person in this room existed because he had stopped to help. Every bit of joy and love and laughter traced back to that moment. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked, her voice still sharp despite her age. "I am thinking that giving you water was the best trade I ever made," Jack said. "I gave you a few swallows from my canteen, and you gave me a lifetime of love." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "We gave each other everything," she said. "That is what love is." They danced at their anniversary party, slowly and carefully, Jack's cane set aside, both of them moving to music only they could hear. Their family watched with tears and smiles, seeing the devotion that still burned bright after 5 decades. Jack died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935, at the age of 79. He went to bed beside Catherine one night and simply did not wake up. The doctor said it was his heart, that it had just worn out after years of hard use. But Catherine knew better. Jack's heart had never been weak. It had been the strongest thing about him. The funeral was enormous. The church in Prescott overflowing with ranchers and townsfolk, students Catherine had taught, and their children and grandchildren, all the people whose lives the Garretts had touched. They buried Jack on a hill overlooking his ranch, with a view of the mountains he had loved. Catherine stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and felt like part of her had been buried too. 53 years together, more than half a century of shared life, and now she was expected to continue without him. But she did continue because that was what you did. She moved in with James and Emily, spending her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about a cowboy who had once given water to a dying woman and asked for nothing in return. She lived for 3 more years, long enough to see another great-grandchild born, long enough to celebrate her 79th birthday. But everyone could see she was fading, that she was just marking time until she could be reunited with Jack. Catherine died on a spring morning in 1938, sitting in her favorite chair on James and Emily's porch, looking out at the mountains. She simply closed her eyes and did not open them again. The doctor said it was natural causes, old age, that her body had just given out. But her family knew she had died of a broken heart, that she had held on as long as she could, but could not bear to be separated from Jack any longer. They buried her next to Jack on the hill, and James made sure the headstone told their story. Catherine Monroe Garrett, 1859 to 1938. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and teacher. Jack Garrett, 1856 to 1935. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, and rancher. United in life and in death. Their love was built on a simple act of kindness, and it endured forever. The ranch stayed in the family, passing to James and eventually to his children and their children. Catherine's school became part of the Prescott school system, educating generations of children. The story of how Jack and Catherine met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. And on a hill overlooking mountains and grazing land, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of a cowboy who had given water to a stranger and the woman who had loved him for it. The desert wind blew across the graves, carrying the scent of sage and pine. And if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of laughter, the memory of a love that had conquered wilderness and time and death itself. Because some things endure beyond the mortal world, some loves are strong enough to become legend, to inspire those who come after to be kinder, braver, more generous with their hearts. And on that hill, under the wide Arizona sky, Jack and Catherine Garrett rested together, their story complete, their love eternal, their legacy living on in every descendant who carried their names and their values forward into the future. The desert that had nearly killed Catherine had instead given her everything. The cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger had found the love of his life. And from that single moment of simple human decency, an entire universe of love and family and community had grown. That was the miracle, really. Not that Jack had found Catherine in the desert, but that such a small gesture, water offered freely with no expectation of reward, could bloom into something so vast and beautiful and enduring. It was a testament to the power of kindness, to the way one good choice could ripple outward through time, creating waves of love and happiness that touched hundreds of lives. And so their story ended not in tragedy, but in triumph, not in loneliness, but in legacy. 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a life together from nothing, who had loved each other through joy and hardship for more than half a century. 2 people whose names would be remembered and honored by generations yet unborn, whose example would inspire their descendants to be generous, to be kind, to stop when they saw someone in need and offer help without counting the cost. On that hill overlooking the Arizona high country, under skies that blazed with stars just as bright as they had been the night Jack first gave Catherine water, 2 souls rested together in peace. Their bodies had returned to the earth, but their love remained, woven into the fabric of the land itself, enduring as the mountains, constant as the stars, eternal as the desert that had brought them together. And that was how a cowboy and a teacher, a man and a woman who had nearly missed each other entirely, who had met by chance in the most desperate of circumstances, created something that would last forever. Their love story had begun, with water offered freely in the desert, and it would never end, living on in memory and in blood, and in the example they had set for how 2 people should love each other completely, generously, and without reservation, from that first moment until the very end and beyond.